I'm also a registered psychologist, and for those of you who maybe aren't sure what a registered psychologist does or who we are, a registered psychologist has undergraduate and graduate training in psychology and counseling, and we work with people who are experiencing everyday mental health issues. So some of the main areas that I work in providing counseling and psychological services to people in areas like anxiety, mood disorders, things like depression, people who've experienced various forms of trauma. I work a lot with women as well in the area of sexuality or work-related concerns or ministry-related challenges. So just a fun fact about myself, I actually attended Elam Young Adults many years ago. I served on the lead team as well. And looking back, it's so clear to me how God used that time in my life to really form and shape in me an understanding of seeking first after the kingdom of God. And so I'm so thankful for that time that I had at Elam Young Adults. I want to share with you one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about the topic that we're focused on tonight of healthy boundaries. I was raised in a home that really didn't have healthy boundaries. My dad had experienced a very traumatic childhood. When he was just 11 years old, his mom went into the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine tonsillectomy. And no one knew at that time that she was deathly allergic to penicillin. She died on the operating table. My dad and his younger brother, just 11 and 9 years old at the time, and my grandfather didn't handle the death of his wife well at all. He turned to alcohol to cope and actually became a severe alcoholic. My dad and his younger brother were very neglected in their childhood, and my dad handled it by actually running away from home. He lived on the streets for many years, and he got involved in gang life. He loved beautiful cars, even cars that did not belong to him. And so by the time that he was 18 years old, he was sentenced to time in the federal penitentiary in Prince Albert. Fortunately, he had a grandmother in his life who reached out to him and helped him to turn his life around when he got out of prison. So growing up in my home with my dad, he made a lot of steps forward in recovering from some of the traumatic things that he'd been through, but there were some things that he just never dealt with. And that really affected the home life that I grew up in. And so it was more so into my young adult years that I began to learn about and understand what healthy boundaries looked like. And they have helped to facilitate healthier relationships in my life and to bring a greater sense of peace within me. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you about this topic more tonight.
Okay, my name is Stephanie, and I'm currently on maternity leave, but when I go back to work, I'll be working as a provisional psychologist, also at CCS. I work with children, youth, young adults, adults, kind of across the lifespan in the areas of mood disorders, anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorders, relationship concerns, life transitions. So that's a little bit about the work that I do. And I also attended Elam Young Adults and was also on the leadership team, so also an alumni. And I actually became a Christian, it was 10 years ago this year in October, Mike was there, at a young adults retreat. So yeah, just this group holds such a special place in my heart and has been so foundational in building my faith, my theology, and my community. And now I serve on the young and married team with my husband here at Elam too. So I love Elam and I'm really excited to be talking to this group. And when Pastor Luke approached me to talk about this, even though I was on maternity leave, I said yes because I'm so passionate about boundaries. It's one of my favorite topics to discuss with clients because it's been foundational and life-changing for me. I grew up with a lot of self-worth, identity issues, anxiety from a very young age. I remember being anxious in kindergarten. I was really sensitive to the feelings of others, and I was so consumed with fear that I had done something wrong, someone was mad at me. Has anyone ever had that experience that someone's like text you and they're like, gotta talk to you, and you like immediately think it's something bad? That was my default, sometimes still is. And I had a hard time focusing on what I needed, what I wanted, because I was so focused on what other people needed and wanted. And just through my training, through becoming a counselor and also becoming a Christian, God has just really developed a strong identity in me, his identity in me, right? And my strength and security has just allowed me to be, conscientious and empathetic towards others without taking responsibility for them. So it just has been so life-giving and empowering to me to have boundaries, and I'm really excited to talk about them tonight.
Awesome. So in our presentation tonight, we're going to define what a boundary is. We're going to talk about the different types of boundaries. We're going to discuss why boundaries are so important. We're going to hear a bit about what the Bible has to say about boundaries, and we're going to learn a little bit about how to set healthy boundaries. So we'll start off with a definition of boundaries. Boundaries separate one object from another. Super simple. A helpful way to understand what a boundary is to think of a fence. Okay? Fences tell us where one property begins and another ends. They establish what belongs to one person and what belongs to another. So interpersonal boundaries function in the same way. Boundaries exist in all of our relationships, whether it's our friendships, romantic relationships, work relationships, or with our family. Boundaries just tell us where we end and someone else begins. They help us understand what belongs to us and what belongs to someone else. And an illustration that I like to use for interpersonal boundaries is this hula hoop. Okay? So this hula hoop defines my personal space. It defines what belongs to me, including my thoughts, my feelings, my likes, my dislikes, what I want, what I choose, and what I do. So a boundary violation occurs when someone tries to tell us what we should think, what we should feel, what we should want, what we should do, or even how we should speak. Boundary violations also occur when we try to take responsibility for someone else's thoughts or their feelings or what they would like or their behaviors or actions or words. So Stephanie and I are going to give you an illustration of what a boundary violation actually looks like. Yeah, all right. So it wasn't meant to be that complicated. But now you get actually how complicated it is when a boundary violation happens. So we kind of meant to do that to show you the reality of it. Okay, so I want to talk about the different types of interpersonal boundaries now. There's quite a variety of different types. I'm going to start with physical and sexual boundaries. These are boundaries that are related to our personal space, our sense of privacy, our bodies, who or what we allow within our space, and even when that occurs. So an example of a boundary violation here would be having someone else stand too close to you or touching you without your permission. So again, we're just going to illustrate here. Okay. Here we got a bit of a boundary violation, okay? Now, I just kind of want to clarify, it's not a perfect example because I actually know Stephanie really well, and I'm quite comfortable with having her in my personal space, and I actually gave her permission before we did this presentation for her to come in my personal space. A true boundary violation physically would be if someone comes in to your personal space and you're actually not comfortable with them being there, or they do something that causes you to feel uncomfortable when they're so close in your personal space. There are emotional boundaries, And these are boundaries that help distinguish my emotional responses versus someone else's emotional responses, or what belongs to somebody else emotionally. So an example of a boundary violation here would be blaming someone else for my own angry feelings. Okay, so you maybe heard people say, "Ugh, you make me so angry." That's actually not possible. Okay, we can't make anyone feel anything. Our emotions and our feelings belong to us. We're responsible for them. Thirdly, there are mental boundaries. These are boundaries that protect the integrity of my own thoughts, values, and opinions. So an example of a boundary violation here would be being told by a friend or a family member what you should like, what you shouldn't like, or what you should think about a certain topic. So Stephanie and I are going to illustrate an example of this.
So, we just had an election, and say I was having a conversation with Heather about who she voted for, and if I was to say to her, "Why would you vote for that party? That's foolish, that's awful. You really should have voted for who I voted for, because obviously that's the right choice, and you should think that way."
Yeah. All right, there we go. So there's a bit of an example of a boundary violation mentally. There are spiritual boundaries. These are boundaries that determine what you personally believe about God, about spirituality, about doctrine, or about theology. An example of a boundary violation here would be someone telling you, "You aren't a very good Christian if you believe," okay? And they're non-core doctrinal issues. There are also financial boundaries. These are boundaries that help you decide where and how you want to use your money. An example of a boundary violation here would be borrowing money from someone under the agreement that you will repay the funds and then not keeping your word. And lastly, there are material boundaries. These are boundaries that maintain the distinction between items that belong to you versus items that belong to someone else. So some examples of boundary violations here would be if someone takes something that belongs to you without your permission, including maybe a sibling who likes to go into your closet, take some of your clothes or your belongings without asking your permission. Or this could include a roommate who maybe likes to go into the fridge, your food's there, and they don't mind taking a bite of your stuff. Those would be examples of material boundary violations. All right, you're up.
Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten, some definitions of the different types of boundaries, I want to talk about why they're important. And I think there could be like a whole weekend based on this, but I'm just going to go over the main points. So first off, boundaries help you to define your identity, define who you are. They bring a healthy separation and individuation from others. I know where I begin. And I know where I end, I know where the other person begins and where they end. They help you to understand what you want, what you need, what you don't want, what you don't need. And it actually helps you to be clear and confident with who you are, and it helps others to know what to expect from you. And you actually teach others how to treat you by the boundaries that you set. So that's a really, really foundational boundaries are in identity. Another important thing is that boundaries protect you from the control and violation of others. They bring safety. Kind of think of it like a guardrail on a mountain. Guardrails keep you safe from going over the edge. Boundaries protect you in the same way from others. So having clear boundaries makes it difficult for others to control you, and it makes it easier for you to say no when you need to stop unhealthy behavior. When I know I have a boundary, I know when someone crosses it, and I feel prepared to say, I'm not okay with that. And we'll talk more about setting boundaries later, but they can really protect you from harm. And that can be physical harm, psychological harm, emotional, spiritual harm, all the different pieces that Heather has already gone over. Good, decent people set boundaries. I often have to share this with clients. Good people set boundaries. Establishing boundaries actually makes you a safe person. Healthy boundaries are attractive to others because people feel safe and secure with you. They know what to expect from you. They know what's expected of them. and they know that you're going to respect their boundaries in return. People who have healthy boundaries are much more likely to respect other people's boundaries because they understand that boundaries are loving, that boundaries are not rejection, and that they actually provide safety in relationships. Generous people set boundaries. I love this one. It's kind of paradoxical, but if you don't set boundaries, you can just give yourself away. Boundaries allow you to be generous with more people over a longer period of time because you don't burn out. You don't just say yes to everything. And I kind of think of it as like, do you want to be a firework that's like one big spark and then dark? Or do you want to be a slow burning fire that provides light and warmth for a long time? I really struggled with this as a young adult because there's so many opportunities, there's so many things you can do. You want to help people, but I burned out really quickly, and so it was important for me to have boundaries around time. And I've just found that more and more as I've gotten older. Boundaries actually allow other people to grow. When we set a boundary with someone, it can actually help them to become aware that their behavior is problematic, aware how their behavior is affecting us, and it gives them an opportunity to change. It gives them the choice to change. They might not always make that choice, but at least it's there for them. So, for example, if we tell a friend that we're not going to share personal information with them anymore because they have been gossiping and spreading it to other people, they then have a choice to become more trustworthy by keeping that to themselves. And as I said, they might not do that, but they have that ability to grow if they want to. So boundaries allow you to get more of what you want and less of what you don't. So again, there's personal choice in this. However, you can really foster healthy behavior in other people around you. For example, if you have a friend that's constantly texting and on their phone and not engaged when you're together, you can decide to have a conversation with them about your boundary that, hey, when we're together, let's talk face to face, let's put our phones away. And again, they can decide not to do that, and you might have to follow up with some action, and we'll talk about that after. Or they might decide, yeah, I am going to put my phone away. I love you. It's really affecting you. I didn't realize. And let's be more engaged and present together. So they allow you to get more of what you want and less of what you don't. This one's really important. Boundaries promote wellness. A lack of boundaries can result in resentment, anger, burnout, stress, and even anxiety. Boundaries make space for self-care and help to prevent those negative effects of being negatively impacted by a lack of boundaries. Sometimes clients come in, who are experiencing anxiety, and I'll often ask about boundaries. I'll bring up that topic, and sometimes it's kind of a surprise to them, like, why is this related? But I've found so often that lack of boundaries can contribute to feelings of anxiety and stress. And when we go in and explore and realize, we need to put some boundaries in place, it can often be a really key factor in recovery for them. Boundaries bring empowerment and freedom. So boundaries allow you to be responsible for your own feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and they release you from being responsible for the feelings, thoughts, behaviors, choices of other people. And one of my kind of little bites that I like to give people is, you can only be responsible for what you can control. So ask yourself, can you control someone else? Can I control Heather's choices, actions, feelings, behaviors? No, I have no control over that. And I can only control myself. And it's actually really empowering when you realize, like, I am in control of my choices, and I don't need to base them off of what other people want or do. And of course, this freedom also requires responsibility for you. You have to own your choices and your actions too, but it's really empowering. Okay, so boundaries also bring order. Kind of touched on this a little bit with saying yes and no, but without boundaries, you're not really able to regulate demands, ideas, dreams, responsibilities, opportunities, activities that are available to you. And life can become really chaotic. really stressful. And just imagine all of those things like crammed inside your life and inside your little hula hoop. There's not a lot of room in there. So boundaries bring order into our lives. Boundaries preserve your purpose and mission. So once you know what your boundaries are and you're able to put them in place, it actually saves you for the relationships and the opportunities that best fit who you are. Saying no allows you to say yes to the important things. And God has created each one of you with special gifts, abilities, and a purpose, and boundaries allow you to go to the place where God wants you to be and not get sidetracked. So they preserve your mission. And last one here is boundaries promote you. Leaders and employers who have good boundaries themselves know that if you have good boundaries, you can be trusted to state clearly what you can and can't do, that you'll welcome input, that you'll work passionately without burnout. Boundaries are very attractive to healthy people and healthy employers. So it's actually kind of like a little magnet, which is pretty cool. That's just a quick overview of some of the reasons why boundaries are important.
All right, so some of the questions I get asked a lot in counseling sessions about boundaries include things like, is it okay for a Christian to actually have boundaries? Or some people ask, as Christians, aren't we supposed to be like Jesus and therefore lay down our lives for others no matter what? And so we thought it might be helpful to actually take a look at what the Bible has to say about boundaries tonight. God was the first to set boundaries, and he did this when he created. Genesis 1 tells us that God created boundaries between the light and the darkness, the land and the sea. The concept of boundaries actually comes from the very person and the very nature of who God is. He defines himself as a distinct and a separate being, and he takes full responsibility for himself. He tells us what he thinks, he tells us what he feels, what he plans, what he will allow, what he will not allow, what he likes, and what he dislikes. In the Ten Commandments, God set limits and expectations for how, as people, we are to relate to him and to each other. Jesus demonstrated healthy boundaries by regularly taking time for self-care, rest, and to be recharged spiritually by spending time with God the Father, even when so many people called for his attention. And sometimes, we can feel like if our friend or our family member is going through a challenging situation, we can almost feel like we have to be the savior in a certain situation, like it's all up to us. But I want us to remember tonight, there is only one Savior of the world, and that is Jesus Christ. And you know what? Even he took time for regular rest and to practice self-care. And so he gives us a really important and healthy model for living wisely. We demonstrate healthy boundaries in our lives when we balance work and rest properly. In Matthew 11, verses 28 to 30, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." And he invites us, "Learn from me. For I'm gentle, I'm humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." And Jesus didn't mean that life would always be easy for us. But in these verses, he reminds us that even in the hard things of life, when we're feeling weary and burdened, we can come to him and we can always find rest. And that's a really helpful boundary to be aware of in our lives. So in summary, I want to say to you, it is more than okay for a Christian to have healthy boundaries. In fact, when we have healthy boundaries, we are reflecting God in a healthy way, because boundaries help us to steward our lives well, and God's entrusted us with the responsibility to do that, to make good choices with our lives, and to pursue an authentic expression of who He has made each of us to be, and the way that we live, the way we love, the way we give, the way we relate to Him and to others.
Okay, I love that. And we actually have that last verse on the wall at CCS, which I love seeing every day when I'm there. So I want to finish up tonight talking about how to set healthy boundaries. And this is just a brief overview. There's going to be materials out there on the table that we'll be at after that can really, bring you in depth into setting boundaries. But I'll give you an overview. So number one, get to know yourself. Learn about what you like and don't like, what situations make you feel safe or unsafe, what you need or how you want to be treated under different circumstances, in different relationships. And this takes a lot of reflection. And often you don't really know how you feel about these things till you actually go through it and realize oh, that was upsetting or that was uncomfortable. Why is that? And I really encourage you, that's an opportunity when you're feeling discomfort, when you're feeling unpleasant emotions, or when you're feeling good emotions too, just realizing, okay, I'm going to reflect on this and kind of get an understanding of what was happening there and what I want to happen next time. Maybe I want the same thing to happen, or maybe I need to move my boundary, or I need to set a boundary with that person. So number two, understand where your boundaries come from. So this is internal work. Often boundaries are learned through really early experiences within our families, within our communities. We often internalize boundaries unknowingly in the form of core beliefs. So that's a deeply held belief that you have about the way the world works, the way relationships work. Just as an example, you may have grown up in a home where your parents never said no to a church service request. And you always thought they always said yes, and to the detriment maybe of the family. And you started to believe that good Christians never say no. So then you don't have any boundaries. You don't feel like you can say no to requests, and then you work and work and work until you're burnt out. And you feel guilty if you say no. There's a deep sense of guilt that comes up. And so understanding your core beliefs and what I call mistaken beliefs, if they're unhealthy or untrue, you can identify those and address those. And that, again, takes a lot of reflection. Often I do quite a bit of that with clients, and there's lots of good resources for that as well that we can talk about at the back table. So yeah, understand where your boundaries come from. Understand your own beliefs. The next one is rehearse, which is really funny, but it's super helpful. So you can't always anticipate when you're going to need to set a boundary, but if you are planning to have a conversation with someone, I really encourage you to write it down. Write down the main points of what you would want to say to that person and actually practice it out loud. It can be really helpful because then when you go, you're ready to say it. And I am not a naturally assertive person, and so I really need to practice a lot. And I will literally write things down before I call someone. So yeah, rehearse. And the next one is take time to express. So take time to vent strong emotions to a friend, a significant other, God, before going into a planned conversation, if it's planned. Expressing isn't about recruiting others to hate someone with you or be angry at that person with you. It's a chance to explore and express your emotions in a safe, neutral place. And I think it's really helpful to have someone who's going to bring balance, who's not just going to be on your side or just yes to everything you say. My husband's really good at that. He always is but what about? I'm So I usually vent to him because I know it's good for me. So the last, or not the last piece, but an important piece, actually probably one of the most important pieces, is communicate. So we have a lot of unspoken boundaries. Most boundaries are unspoken. And, when we grow up in a certain culture, a certain place, there's many, many rules that we follow just without even being said. Like, for example, how close we stand to someone when we're talking to them. That's just learned social behavior, but it is a boundary. And it's really important to remember people can't read your mind, and sometimes you actually need to have a conversation with them about where your boundary is. And just to encourage you, if you're doing this, just use simple, direct language, and I'll give a few examples. So if someone's yelling at you, just saying to them, it's not okay for you to yell at me. If you continue, I will leave the room. And we'll talk about following up with action after, but just very clear, very simple. If someone is calling you at work all the time, you're not able to get focus, you're not able to focus, and I said call, but let's be real, text. I don't know if anyone calls anymore. Someone's texting you, and they're like, why aren't you texting me back? Like, I saw that you read it. Just saying to them, I've decided that I'm not going to take personal calls, personal texts at work. I need to focus, but once I get home in the evening, if I can and when I can, I'll respond to you. Saying no to extra commitments. So saying something like, even though I love this ministry, it's important to me, I need to decline this request. I have to say no because I need to honor my needs. I need to honor my family's needs. And you don't even need to give a reason. You don't even need to say I'm super busy. You could be like, I have nothing planned this week, but like, I'm not going to do that. That's okay. We don't have to be doing something else in order to say no. We can be doing nothing and still say no. Then second last, I keep saying last, but it's not. There's like 3 more points. Repeat. So when you're setting boundaries, you don't need to defend, you don't need to debate, you don't need to over-explain your feelings. You can clarify, certainly. There can be a conversation, but I want you to know you don't have to make a case for your boundary to someone. You can be firm, but also be gracious and direct, and that's loving communication. And if you're faced with resistance, just repeat your statement. Repeat what your boundary is. This is probably one of the other really, really important points coming up, is you need to back up your boundary with action. I've been saying that kind of throughout the presentation. And if possible, determine what that action is going to be prior to setting a boundary so that you kind of have a game plan. Okay, if they don't respect this or this gets crossed, what am I going to do? And make sure you communicate that to the person before so they understand the consequences of respecting or not respecting a boundary. One of the most important things you can do is to follow through on that action if your boundary is violated, especially in like long-term close relationships, because if you don't follow through on action, someone's going to learn like, oh, they don't really mean what they say. Like, I know I can get away with this. I know I can like step into their boundary and cross the line, and like I'm not going to have any consequences. So it's really important to back up your boundary with action. And that's really hard. I really struggled with that when I felt really guilty when I did follow through. And there is like a painful growing process with that, but you will get through the other side. And there's a lot of freedom there. Okay, this is the last point. Okay. So the last thing is strengthen your internal boundaries. An internal boundary is like an invisible shield that prevents you from just taking in a comment or something that someone else says about you without first checking it out. It's kind of like a border crossing. So if someone accuses you of being arrogant, before you like take that into your identity and be like, I am arrogant, this is terrible, stop and consider like, okay, I want to ask myself some questions about this statement that someone said. This is especially important if you're around difficult people or a critical parent. So ask yourself, how much of that is actually true about me? Have other people said this to me? Is this present in other areas of my life? How much of this might be about the other person and what's going on with them? And what do I need to do, if anything, to regain my personal power and stand up for myself? Do I need to talk to this person about what's been said? So that's the different steps to setting boundaries. There's so much more, but those are kind of the key pieces. And as we wrap this night up, there's just 2 things that I wanted to finish off with, is that Consistency is really key to developing boundaries, especially in those long-term relationships. And introducing boundaries where there hasn't been any before is really hard, and often it's met with resistance, it's met with disagreement, maybe even with feelings of rejection from that other person. But it's really important for your well-being, for the other person's well-being, that you continue to do that. So it's just step by step. Start with something small and work your way up. And just remember, boundaries also isn't about getting your way or having power over the other person or controlling people. It's actually about helping yourself and others to interact with respect, honor, and love. And, as we were doing this, making this presentation, I kind of had this thought that a lot of our content was from the perspective of setting boundaries and having our boundaries crossed. But I really encourage you to also reflect on, are you respecting boundaries of the people around you? Are you respecting the boundaries of the people that you love? Sometimes we don't realize that we're crossing boundaries. We're maybe not aware of them, or their boundaries feel like rejection to us, so we are going to cross them anyways because we don't want to feel alone or rejected. But respecting other people's boundaries is just as important as having your own respected and setting your own. And I actually find that as you grow in your own ability to set your own boundaries, you become more aware of other people's and more respectful of them because, it's reciprocal. So that's kind of one piece I want you to also be thinking about, is the boundaries of the people that you love and care about in your life. I think that's kind of all the points that we had, and now we can open the floor up for some questions.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Alrighty, so we've been getting a lot of great questions sent in already, but once again, if you do have questions that you'd like to send in, you can just go to menti.com, punch in that code, and send in your questions, and we'll pass them along. And if we don't have time to get to all the questions, or if some of them are maybe of too personal a nature to discuss up here in front of everyone, afterwards, Stephanie and Heather are going to be out in the atrium sitting at a table, and you'll have an opportunity to go and ask them questions one-on-one, or to maybe, if you want to hear more about the Christian counseling ministry, then you can have that opportunity to ask them questions about that outside after we finish in here. So
I'm going to try and kind of group some questions together, I guess. But one that's kind of been asked several times is the difference between boundaries and walls. So for example, how can we be aware of boundaries that are disguised as walls? Is there such a thing as setting too many boundaries that close you off? And is putting up walls different than setting boundaries?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, there's a difference between walls and boundaries. If we dive deeper into understanding how boundaries work, there are tendencies that we all have to either be rigid in establishing boundaries, so that would be more like putting up walls, where maybe if we've been hurt deeply by someone in the past, we've got these high walls up and we're like, I'm not letting anybody into my heart anymore. On the flip side, we can move in the direction of having what's called porous boundaries, and that means we just kind of let everyone's thoughts and feelings affect us. We maybe move in the direction of people-pleasing. So there's definitely a difference between walls and healthy boundaries. What else should we add to that one, Steph? Is there anything else that comes to your mind?
That was great. And, I think one of the concepts that I use to describe this, because it's a continuum, right, of how kind of rigid or flexible your boundaries are. Sometimes I use an analogy with rope. If we think of mountain climbing, has anyone ever climbed a mountain? That's amazing. I'm impressed. So if you're mountain climbing, I want you to think of, there's kind of 3 different scenarios here. Number 1, think of like a tiny, like little delicate rope chain, like super, super little, and you're like strapping that on and trying to climb up the mountain. You're not going to feel very safe. That rope isn't really doing much protection. It's probably going to break if you fall. So that's like a really porous boundary. It's like not offering a lot of protection. Then I want you to think of like the big ropes that hold like ocean tankers like onto shore, and they're like as big as your like leg or something. Imagine trying to climb a mountain with that. Like, it's going to keep you safe. Yeah, if you fall, you're not going anywhere, but also like it's limiting you from climbing. It's limiting you from engaging in real relationships, if you kind of go outside of the example, but it's not really functional. And then you think of kind of healthy boundaries, and that's like a good mountain climbing rope that is designed for that. It protects you if you fall, but it also allows you to progress and grow and grow in relationships. So that's kind of how I like to describe the difference between like something that might be a wall is like too rigid of a rope, too big of a rope, and something that is, you know, not a boundary at all is a rope that would break.
Awesome. A couple other questions that kind of group together well. How do you deal with somebody who doesn't seem to have really any concept of boundaries? How do you engage in relationship with them? Or also, if you've communicated boundaries and that person has made you feel guilty or bad about those boundaries, how do you engage them? How do you continue in that relationship dynamic?
So to answer the first part, how do you help someone who doesn't have an understanding of boundaries? You know, that's not easy, because it's not like you can give them a book and be like, read this book. So, you know, I think it's about having conversation and relationship. It's not easy, you know, to continue to engage and love someone who doesn't have that concept. But I think as much as you can, starting to open up that conversation, becoming more educated yourself is always, I think, helpful, so you can speak to that topic. Having resources on hand if they are open and interested to that. And of course, they have to make that choice, right? You can't teach them. You can present it, but you can't learn it for them. And so I would say just having conversation. I know that's a simple answer, but it's hard. I know it's hard to do. The second part, was like, what if you've set a boundary, they're not respecting it, and they're making you feel guilty? You know, kind of going back to what Heather spoke about, no one can make you feel anything. And that's actually a lack of boundary. You are responsible for your feelings and emotions, and certainly you can have automatic responses. We all have that, but then you get to decide what you do with that. And so I think that's kind of one key there is strengthening your internal boundaries, that I'm not responsible for this person, and just continuing to set that with them and saying like not allowing, you know, them to make you feel guilty, and not allowing your guilt to be your motivator. What's motivating your choices and your decisions? Is it coming from a place of love, a place of serving God, or is it coming from a place of guilt? And then the next part is, if someone isn't respecting your boundary, whatever the action was that you said, like, okay, if you don't respect my boundary, I'm going to do this, then you need to follow up on that and actually follow through on it.
Okay. How do you set boundaries or communicate boundaries with people in power? So including professors, bosses, family members, the whole category.
Yeah, that's a great question. Carefully. I guess there's a lot of power dynamics in relationships that can exist in the workplace or in an educational setting. But I think what I'd like to say is, I just find it helpful to remember boundaries at their simplest. And those simple concepts of healthy boundaries don't change, really, no matter what context you find yourself in. You're still responsible for what you think, what you feel, what you say, what you do, and so is that other person. If you're in a position where that person's in a power dynamic and you feel that they continuously override your boundaries in some way, I'd encourage you to reach out to kind of an equalizer, someone else, either in your employment situation or the school setting, that can be an advocate and a support for you in helping to have conversations about resetting healthy boundaries or addressing boundary violations that are happening. Anything you want to add, Steph?
Okay, great. Another question that we got is, within the relationship, is it okay to have physical affection as part of it, and and where do you set boundaries for physical touch? What becomes unhealthy, and how do you engage creating healthy boundaries for that?
Ooh, I love this one. I'm assuming this is romantic. I mean, it could be friendship too, but I'll speak to it from a romantic sense. I think, for everyone, there's going to be different levels of physical affection they're comfortable with, for personal reasons, for moral reasons. And I won't speak so much to that, but more so how to have that conversation. I think you should have that conversation before you even start dating that person. And it's awkward. I have been there. You should ask my husband about it. But it's really important because you both go in knowing what are our boundaries. And I use that concept of guardrails. Actually, I stole it from Andy Stanley. He's a pastor, but he talks about physical boundaries in relationships like a guardrail. If you think of like a beautiful mountain road, the guardrail isn't like on the very, very edge of the mountain. It's like a good ways in. So if your like car bumps up against it and goes through it a little bit, you're not immediately over the edge of the mountain. And I think that's a really key for setting physical boundaries, is like set them a good way in. Like, don't like push your boundary to like the absolute like closest to where I'm comfortable. You want to, make it a bit more safe. And I think having that conversation early and being on the same page, being clear about it, and then also having an action plan like, okay, if we cross this boundary, what are we going to do to reestablish it? How are we going to talk about that with each other? How are we going to make it not awkward? And really, truly making sure you're on the same page. If you're not on the same page with someone with physical boundaries, most of the time you are going to end up going to wherever, like if their boundary is like closer to the edge of the mountain, you're going to go there. You're never, one person isn't going to be like, oh, I'm comfortable going like this far physically, but you're like only here, like, oh yeah, I'll respect that. Like, I think that's a little unrealistic. So sorry, I could talk about this for a long time, but
no, that's
Andy Stanley has a great podcast series called, I think, Guardrails, and I would really recommend listening to that one.
As a follow-up to that, for people who maybe haven't had the idea of setting healthy boundaries ahead of time and have maybe engaged in some behavior that they wish they hadn't, how do they go about then creating boundaries now in their relationship if that's something that they want to do? What are some ways to engage and make that part of a healthy relationship?
Do you mean within the same relationship, or say they had like a past relationship?
Within the same relationship.
Yeah. I think that in that case, it's probably helpful to have like some accountability. And I'm kind of hesitant to be like accountability partners, but I think actually having some going to talk to someone, because especially if that say you're the person who felt like their boundary was kind of violated, like they weren't quite comfortable, that actually can have a really deep impact. And, I might, pass this over to you in a minute to talk about that, because you can be surprised at how much that actually destroys trust in a relationship. So not only are you reestablishing a boundary, you're reestablishing safety and trust in that relationship. And so I think talking about that in a really safe place, taking the time to acknowledge like what has actually been the impact on this, other than maybe we feel guilty or, maybe there was some kind of other consequence, but really figuring out like what was the emotional and spiritual impact of this. Do you have anything to add to that, Heather?
I don't. That's good stuff, yeah.
Okay, I'm kind of like summarizing, if that's a word, a few questions into one. Just kind of talking about having boundaries with toxic people or unhealthy people in your life, and how to actually, like, some tips or steps to actually hold those boundaries in place.
Yes. So that's a great question, and what I want to say is if you're interacting with a person who is toxic or is difficult, I'll actually say to you, congratulations. In a way, this is like the best scenario to practice firm and healthy boundary setting. And I guess I'm kind of repeating myself in a way, but just holding on to that simple reality of how to practice healthy boundaries. It really doesn't get more complicated than what we've talked about tonight. So knowing that you're responsible for your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own actions, that you have the right to communicate a boundary. Please don't talk to me that way. If you continue to talk to me that way, I'm going to leave the room, I'm going to leave the conversation, I'm not going to relate to you in the same way that we have been previously. And it's a really challenging dynamic to interact with someone who is difficult or toxic in a way, but the good news is if you can maintain your healthy boundaries in that interaction, there isn't any situation or person that you won't be able to navigate them with in the future.
Yeah, and I think I would add for that, like I have a lot of empathy for those types of situations, because often like toxic can also be someone who's really hurt and who's experienced a lot of trauma. So you also like, there might be a feeling of like, I need to help this person, you know, they're hurting. And it sounds so harsh to say like remove that person from your life or remove yourself, you know. But I was listening to a podcast by Dr. Henry Cloud, who wrote a book on boundaries that you'll see on the table out there, and he made such a good point. And he said, you are not removing that person from your life. That person is making a choice. They are choosing to either like to respect your boundary and then like be able to experience relationship with you, or they're saying like, no, I won't respect that, so like they're making the choice to leave that relationship. It certainly doesn't feel that way, but that's one thing I really encourage. If you get to the point with someone where you need to you know, actually not have any relationship with them, and it's okay to have different types of relationships with people. Like you can still be in a relationship with someone who in some situations who's toxic, but you might like, it might be like much further away and many more boundaries than someone who is safe.
Great. All right, we want to respect your time, so we're just going to do one more question. There's several questions that have come in that we haven't been able to get to yet, and so if you do have more questions, like we said, Heather and Stephanie are going to be out at a table in the atrium afterwards, so feel free to go in and relay those questions one-on-one. But the last one that we're going to ask you about is, you had mentioned that in order to set healthy boundaries, you have to really know yourself and know your likes and dislikes and know what is safe for you and what isn't. If you're not a person who's naturally introspective and good at asking those kinds of questions of yourself, how can you go about learning yourself well enough to be able to set healthy boundaries?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it does take time. I think God is like really the one who shows us our hearts. You know, he knows us the best. He knows everything about us. He's designed us, and I think having conversation and prayer and reflection, like just that time with God, is so revealing, right? And so I really encourage you. That's the number one source is going to God and learning about yourself, and learning about his identity in you and developing that. And obviously that happens in many, many ways, but I would say like that's your first go-to. And then beyond that, you know, I think like going to a counselor or, you know, a psychologist, or even someone who maybe is really gifted in introspection themselves, that can be really fantastic for developing that skill. They'll be able to give you, like especially a counselor, be able to give you tools and resources on like how to do that. And then as well, there's just resources that we have out in the back there that you can take a look at. Dr. Henry Cloud is, you know, writes extensively on boundaries. I would say any of his books are fantastic. I also have a workbook back there that I really like for exploring boundaries. But I think it is just finding the right resources, talking to the right people, and, you know, number one, talking to God.
Sweet. All right, would you guys please join me in thanking Heather and Stephanie for making time to come and share with us tonight. And yeah, we'll dismiss you guys to go out to the atrium, and we'll see